Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Tech Can't Save Us podcast brought to you by Literal Humans. As always, I am your co-host, Paul David, CEO and co-founder of Literal Humans. I'm joined today by an incredible guest, Kat Hamilton, Director of Partnerships and Programs at Force of Nature. Welcome to the pod.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Really great to have you on. We've only done one or two sort of climate change focused episodes so far, so we're excited to expand our portfolio and dig into the great work you're doing at Force of Nature.
Yeah, I definitely am curious to have a chat with you about it. I think it's really important that we have conversations at the intersection of like tech and climate and global solutions. So it's great to be here.
Unfortunately, dear listeners, our esteemed co-host, William Gadsby-Peet, Chief Strategy Officer, another co-founder at Literal Humans. Poor thing is surfing in San Sebastian this week, so we had to give him a break. He's been working hard, so he'll be missed. And we got Adi from our team doing production on the background. So thank you to both of them. First things first, would love to talk to you a bit about the headlines, but before we get into that, want to hear a bit more about what partnerships and programs entails and just Force of Nature. If you could just give us like a 1 or 2 minute intro about what you do and what Force of Nature is for our audience.
Force of Nature, we're a youth nonprofit mobilizing mindsets for climate action. And what that actually looks like is we work at the intersection of kind of like mindset challenges and climate action. What is it that allows us to step up or shut down in the face of what is an existential crisis, right? We were founded by Clover Hogan in 2019 and came out of this kind of need that she saw as she was speaking to business leaders and folks in policy and government and going to global climate summits like the COPs. And at the same time was in classrooms speaking to young people who were feeling just overwhelmingly anxious, like stressed, overwhelmed by the crisis. And she was seeing these emotions in kind of all parties involved. And so Force of Nature came out of that need to really address, like, what is it that comes up in us emotionally? What are the things that stand in our way of taking climate action from a mindset perspective? And like, how do we actually use our emotions as a conduit that allow us to step up rather than just shut down?
That's amazing. And I'm glad you mentioned emotions, because one of the first pieces we shared with you was, this piece about young people experiencing eco anxiety. And one thing I loved about the piece is it, dove into the intersectionality and it highlighted, that the research had been done about youth in Sweden, but obviously, developed countries, quote unquote, tend to be obviously the biggest producers of emissions. And, it highlighted the difference between young people in, different countries and different economic statuses experiencing climate anxiety. So super curious to hear how you've engaged with young people around this issue of eco-anxiety and some of the intersectional differences you've seen.
We actually started off doing some research in young people way back in 2020, beginning of the pandemic. And we were seeing this kind of like rise in research happening around understanding eco-anxiety as this like new phenomenon, right? What we found in our research was that over 70% of young people feel hopeless about the climate crisis and powerless to create change. And actually only 26% felt that they knew how to contribute to solving the climate crisis. And we really see eco-anxiety at that intersection, right? Coming from these beliefs of like being too small to make a difference and also that the system is too broken to create meaningful change. And I think what I liked about this article was that it did speak about how it isn't monolithic, right? Like this experience of eco-anxiety is really varied around the world, across young people, across generations even. And I don't think it's a new phenomenon. That's something that we talk about at Force of Nature. It's actually a really natural thing to feel like anxious and stressed and scared in the face of a crisis that is like looming and feels very out of our control in many ways, right? In a system that is so complex and made up of so many decision makers across different industries and levels, like actually we see eco-anxiety not as a new phenomenon at all, but it's just a new name for a phenomenon that already existed. There's greater awareness now, more than ever, of deeply entrenched global inequality. We see like people in elected positions of power repeatedly failing to act with the urgency that the crisis demands. We all feel guilt in many ways at our own personal or individual responsibility in the face of a lot of media, which tells us that actually it's our individual actions that everything rests on, right? And a really uncertain future. Like there's so many conversations now across generations about what the crisis means for us. And we're seeing in real time, and people have been seeing in real time for a long time, the kinds of environmental disasters that come as a result of a rapidly changing climate that is caused by the emissions of fossil fuels and the most emitting countries in the world, right? So it's like, it doesn't feel, put in that perspective, it doesn't feel like a new thing, like, oh, oops, like young people are feeling eco-anxiety. It's like, oh, like eco-anxiety is a kind of amassing of feelings across people of all generations. And we focus on young people because that's where our lived experience is, but it's actually a totally normal phenomenon. and one that now that it's in the mainstream, we're having more and more conversations about, which I think is really valuable.
You nailed it. You called out the intergenerational piece, which the article also mentions, and the need for more intergenerational spaces. Been dying to ask you about these youth-led climate cafes that y'all are running at COP27, and just that sounds like a great potential intergenerational space for that, and a really important one. So we'd love to hear your perspective on those intergenerational spaces and sort of what's happening at COP27.
Thanks for bringing that up. I think the intergenerational piece is something that often gets missed when we say we're a youth org and that we focus on youth climate action, but it actually is like a cornerstone of all of the work that we do. So for us, like we do believe that young people hold a lot of ability to challenge systems, right? We call it constructive disruption, kind of these transformational ideas or being able to imagine things outside of the status quo that we've been taught is the only way to do things. And at the same time, people who are in positions of power, whether you're a parent or an educator or a business leader, CEO, founder, policymaker, like folks who have the kind of power to make decisions about the future of the planet in many ways, on the other side of it, may also feel eco-anxious, may also be feeling some of the effects, of climate disaster that is impending or has already happened in their communities, and at the same time often feel quite bound by the systems that they exist within, right? Like we speak to a lot of folks in business who feel as though they don't have the power to make a difference either, and that actually they're constrained by their shareholders who require a certain amount of profit quarter on quarter. And so actually bringing these groups of people together and saying, okay, well, what would it look like if business was done differently? What does imagining a different future, like pushing what is possible, bringing the kind of disruption that young people are able to into those spaces, and also just like refreshing the energy. Like we often find that there's a lot of like burnout or exhaustion, or like it feels like hard work to talk about changing a system or to talk about making sustainability the norm. But actually, when we bring the energy of young people into these rooms and we have these kind of constructive conversations that are still challenging and come from a place of like real humanity and emotion, we really see things moving. And so for us, like last year we were at the COP26 in Glasgow, and we ran an activation there that was all around like having people express their climate emotions. And we found that to be really effective. And this year we have opted not to go to Egypt for the COP27. It's really important to us that there is youth-led community hubs outside of that space to continue the conversation, and to not, so often when we look at these summits or we watch what's happening, we feel disempowered by the lack of urgency and action that seemingly is coming about from these spaces. And so for us, we decided this year to run climate cafes, which are spaces for folks to come together and have conversations about their climate emotions and to ideate avenues for action and to talk about what is working in their communities as well as what emotions are coming up for them. And so we're going to be hosting a flagship cafe in London with the Natural History Museum during the 2 weeks of the COP. And at the same time, we have launched, or are launching in the next couple of weeks, a guide for others to host their own climate cafes. And we have folks in our community of young people who are planning on hosting their own local climate cafe in their community and bringing these conversations together. So we really want to like enable young people to host these spaces and ensure that there are folks of all ages from different communities coming together to have these conversations, because we really do believe in emotions and humanity as like a catalyst for a lot of the change that we need to see that is community led.
Absolutely. First things first, if you need help sort of marketing and advertising these climate cafes, particularly the one in London, please let us know. It's what we do as a specialty. So we'd love to help with that and just help to get the word out.
Amazing.
One of our cooler projects right now is on cannabis use and sort of, the mental health implications of it. And we're helping the folks at King's College London
Awesome.
really diversify their pool of respondents for that. So, we like to kind of get in these like niches and reach more young people, reach, folks of color, and just broaden reach. So happy to help with that.
Absolutely. That would be fantastic.
And then another question I had for you, just follow up. You mentioned the significance and power of emotions. And the second piece that I shared is about, this big honking term, climate anxiety disorder, and sort of, understanding the difference between that and eco anxiety. But I'm super curious to hear some of the emotions that you kicked up. Like, what were some of the more surprising ones that you heard from young people when you actually gave them space to share their emotions about climate change?
It was interesting. This article definitely like stirred something in me. I think one of the things that we talk about, we get asked a lot at Force of Nature is like, is eco-anxiety an illness, right? Because obviously like mental health has become much more of a mainstream conversation, rightfully as it should be. And equally, like when we talk about things like anxiety and depression, like these are diagnosed disorders as well, right? And so we speak about it at Force of Nature like we really emphasize that in the way that we speak about it, at least eco-anxiety is not a clinical condition in the capacity that we interact with it in, right? Like we're not psychologists, we're not within the medical field. And so that's kind of not an area that we venture into. But what we see is as a kind of like amalgamation of a descriptor of emotions. I've talked before about like feeling anxious in response to like, what is now the sixth mass extinction or like pervasive plastic pollution, climate tipping points. Like these are all really normal, natural responses to feel this kind of anxiety. And the kind of other things that we see come up are really on a spectrum. So, we use eco-anxiety as this catch-all phrase, and things that we're describing are feelings of dread, despair, fear, grief, rage, sort of really heavy emotions that come up when we ask in a room, how does the climate crisis make you feel? And we really get a range from young people. And we also see responses like, overwhelmed, guilty, confused, curious in some cases. And so there is like such a spectrum of emotions there. And I think like for sure, I would say for anyone who is like acutely experiencing eco-anxiety in a way that is like debilitating or affecting your life, like seek professional help. I think there's definitely like these things can all tip us over a ledge into areas where we may need more support. But for us at Force of Nature, what we see is that anxiety and this kind of eco-anxiety catch-all can be a critical catalyst for action. We think there's like space to navigate those emotions, and they do need to be navigated, and it needs to be facilitated skillfully with the right mix of community support and empowering stories. And we see then what's possible to actually allow ourselves to experience the depth of our feelings and see them as a pivotal part of resilience and our ongoing journey, right? So that we can step up rather than shut down.
That's amazing. The step up piece and the piece you said around guilt really resonated. That there was something in the Crimson piece about like conditioned into self-reliance, like we struggle to kind of see, change as a communal effort where commitment is required by all. I thought that was like so powerful because like you see it in memes, right? Like there's the meme of like, oh, you're drinking your drink with your paper straw and it's melting as like billionaire flies overhead in a private jet for their like third vacation, right? Like stuff like that where like you're just like, man, I'm trying to do my bit, but there's larger problems here and I don't quite know how to like get at them through collective action. So
yeah, that piece that you just said around like with the flow of information, with the kind of critical thinking, like we see the systems that are flawed, right? Like when we're sitting there using our individual paper straw or, we're doing our recycling and then seeing folks use whether it's private jets or whether it's oil companies developing like new pipelines or, whatever it is, like companies that continue to sell us plastic that maybe is non-recyclable or is first use. And, they have marketing schemes and marketing budgets that are beyond what most people's individual salaries in a year are. And you're like, how can we be talking about how we need to buy sustainably when there are these systems in place that mean that no matter how sustainably we buy individually, the whole system is flawed? And when you get to that conversation, it gets so overwhelming, right? Because we're each these little individuals in the face of this system. And I think we see this in young people a lot. There's so much awareness. Like young people are so savvy and so switched on to the challenges and the kind of like system level. And they're sick of being told that it's their responsibility to fix it, right? And at the same time, not seeing what the avenues to like systemic action are. So I think that's like a piece that we have to be better at talking about collectively. And actually, like we see there are so many amazing climate action groups and, nonprofits or organizations who are working towards this kind of systems level change, which looks like, engaging with policymakers at a mass level. It looks like absolutely putting pressure on cities and government to do things differently, putting pressure on companies. And there's all sorts of different actions that are happening around this around the world. But I think that emphasis on community and like collectivism and what it looks like to work together towards something is something we have to get back to, which is really hard in a society that tells us that like our individual success is what's most important, and the kind of like ideals under neoliberal capitalism where it is profit over people. And so I think we're starting to see some shifts away from that on like a community level, but really like the question is, are businesses going to be able to shift at the speed that's needed, and what is their role within this kind of like movement into community action and really community support as well.
To the point of eco-anxiety and climate anxiety disorder, it can feel overwhelming. But I think one of the more interesting things that's coming out of this, the broader movement are how creative people are getting, with mental health solutions, as we mentioned, for folks experiencing eco-anxiety. And then sort of as a bridge to this third piece that we shared from the forum network, people getting really creative in like educational and tech spaces, for example. So, this piece focused on a teacher who's teaching coding, but is asking students to design, solution-oriented products that, help fight the climate crisis instead of consuming more resources within them. And we did an episode a few, I guess like a year ago or something like that about, eco implications of tech and like, your website and your Netflix queue that all is on a server somewhere that's like just pumping out heat and needs to run on electricity and things like that. So super curious to hear your perspective about the inventive stuff that teachers like this are doing to say, hey, if my students are going to learn coding, they might as well learn about climate change and eco solutions as they're coding, as they're building.
The model of education that allows students to problem solve and critically think is like the most important model of education we can have. I was really lucky to, growing up, go to a school called the Green School in Bali, which was really like focused on understanding the systems that make up the world and the communities that are in the world, and like seeing where the challenges are, critically thinking about those, and then coming up with solutions to those challenges. And I think benefit of that was that there is so much creativity in young people, in like students, in people who are studying something that they really care about, right? Which many times that's what you find in, universities or in schools or classrooms. And also it is the ability of those students to best problem solve for their community. And I think that's what's really important that can sometimes be missing is, we talk about like problem solving or creativity or inventiveness, and that's like super important. But if we continue trying to solve problems for communities who we make assumptions about, that's where there's like a shortfall in those solutions. We talk about it in tech all the time, right? Like we talk about user research, like really understanding your customer. And I think that's like, even from like a sociology or an anthropology framework, like really understanding what the methods are to diving into a community and understanding their problems. But I'm kind of getting away from myself a little bit. What I liked about this article was that the educator clearly cared and wanted his students to care as well. Some of the challenges that I saw, I think two of the students came up with carbon footprint calculators. And I think one of the discourses right now within the climate movement, and has been for a while, is this idea that the carbon footprint calculator, first of all, puts too much onus on individual action, but also was designed or funded by oil companies who wanted the focus to be on individual action rather than challenging the companies in the first place who are built on extractivism.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, there's a piece there about like we can't solve the problems with the same thinking that created them, right? So I think when we talk about climate solutions, we have to understand them as planetary and community solutions, right? Like it's not sustainability as an afterthought or like let's make a product and that will sell really well and let's make it sustainable. It's like instead, how do we reframe as it being integrated into our priorities? Like what does it look like? We talk about regeneration. So regeneration over sustainability, it actually puts life at the center of every action and decision. It takes into account the impact on planet, on people, on the community that the thing will exist within. And so I think there's critical thinking that needs to happen about the systems we live in, including like colonialism, extractivism, exploitation of people. And we have to have critical conversations about how the things we create in the world or the way we exist in the world like continues those systems in a way that's really not helpful. We need to frankly analyze our relationship to growth and profit. I think like the tech space has so much potential because it's full of innovators, and at the same time it doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? Like if we're constantly trying to build for the sake of profit, like this idea of like tech for good, what if all tech was for good? Like kind of like reframing to making it integrated, and it is good for everyone. It's not just good for the planet in the long term and ensuring that we have a livable place, but it's really good for communities too. Like some of the best climate action that we see are like climate solutions. A great example is like livable cities, right? We talk about, there's this concept of like the 15-minute city, which is the idea that if you could get everything you needed, all of the amenities you needed in your life within 15 minutes of your home, walking distance, there wouldn't need to be as many cars. Therefore, there wouldn't be as many emissions. You would be able to get anywhere you needed to go within that 15 minutes, which means it would be a better environment for folks with disabilities, for the elderly, for people with children, for children themselves. And the idea that like, these cities would be places to live that would be genuinely enjoyable and good for people, and they're better for the planet. Like what a win-win situation. So I think the more we can design in that way, the better off we're going to be. And it is like a mindset shift, which is really forward to all the work we do at Force of Nature.
Good shout too about Tech for Good. I mean, that's something we focus on, so much. We consider ourselves a Tech for Good podcast and an agency that specializes with Tech for Good brands, but we're definitely seeing that shift towards like every brand wants to be seen as Tech for Good, and they want to, and sometimes obviously it leads to greenwashing and some, not great consequences. But I think like the general public are getting a lot more discerning about like what is greenwashing, what is actually Tech for Good, or what is just sort of impact washing is another one that I heard the other day about just like, hey, we have such an impactful product. Do you? Like, show me the details. You're seeing it in some of the ESG stuff where people are really digging in, at least investors are starting to dig into the metrics and things like that. So it's a really interesting time. Want to pivot us to learn more about Force of Nature so our audience can hear about it. Tell us the basics. How did it get started? What was the inspiration? And how's it going so far?
just to touch on a point quickly, you mentioned people are becoming more discerning and more critical of their choices. I think Tech for Good right now has a place in the rhetoric because they're obviously, it lets us point and say, okay, these are the people who are not Tech for Good, and let's analyze what's going on there. But yeah, we're a force of nature. We work across companies, we work with young people, but then we also work like with boards, we work with educational institutions, we work with researchers. We really like see ourselves as operating in a whole number of different spaces, with our beneficiaries at the end of the day always being young people. So our mission is mobilizing mindsets for climate action, and we started in 2019 after Clover had seen, in decision making spaces, in the various COP summits, in consultancies where she was actually part of a sustainable consultancy at the time. She was seeing the same rhetoric of like, I'm too small to make a difference. The actions that I make won't help the overall system. Force of Nature was really born out of that and started with eco-anxiety workshops for young people. So our whole theory of change was around understanding how our emotions shape our mindsets, and how through understanding our emotions and acknowledging those mindset challenges, we're able to then create a new story internally that allows us to have more resilience, shift our mindset into a place of action and agency, focus on where we are. And so we started working with young people in that capacity in different schools, and eventually branched into working with businesses on the same challenges. So we saw the same mindset challenges coming up. We went into businesses and have been going into businesses to unlock those mindset barriers around climate action, which like we hear the rhetoric of sustainability in business, right? We hear the rhetoric of like ESG and like measurements and things like that around like sustainability now being a part of business. And there's more and more kind of rhetoric around this. And for sure, there's room for greenwashing there, which we also see, and work with young people to actually like distinguish where the greenwash is and really like challenge that as well. But we realized through all of this work that we really wanted to like close the loop between the inspired and active young people and the decision makers with power in business who felt exhausted or disillusioned. So it is bringing that energy and insight together with the experience and power in places that really need the transformational action. So we call it constructive disruption. But the intergenerational forums that we were kind of chatting about earlier are really the core to that, and core to our work. So we've been running training programs with young people to ensure that they're equipped to go into these spaces, while at the same time, through workshops and keynotes and activations, actually going into the businesses or the policy rooms and saying, are you actually ready to be disrupted, right? Like, where is your mindset currently in terms of being able to challenge limiting beliefs or structures of status quo that we see and get used to, and bring young people into those spaces, or bring young people up within those spaces. So in many companies, there's like so many young people who are ready to do something transformational, but may not feel like psychologically safe to do so in that space, or may not understand like how they fit into the overall strategy of the company, or what their place is, or what they own. And so we really work in those spaces to ensure that like young people are equipped, but also that the space is ready for the young people, and that then that constructive disruption can really happen internally so that we can push further, because we know that like there's no more time for incrementalism. Like, transformational action is needed, and fundamental shifts in the systems that we live within. And those are not easy, relaxed things to do, right? Like, it requires a lot of work and it requires the energy. And that's really where we see like young people being able to step into those spaces, but equally ensuring that those young people are paid, because we see over and over again free work demanded by activists, and emotional vulnerability and emotional work that young people have to do coming into these spaces, where it's like, oh, well, like you can come in and disrupt, but like you're the young person, so you just take on that emotional labor. And at the same time, like the kind of youth washing that can happen, that's like now we're seeing more and more like brands that put youth activists on their front pages, but it's like, are those young people getting fairly compensated? Are they being acknowledged for their work through like payment that is necessary within the system we live in, right, in order to have like a sustainable life that is ongoing? So I think that's another piece that we really see ourselves playing.
Can I ask about like constructive disruption specifically? Because I'm curious about how the pieces all fit together in like the broader movement. Like, obviously we've got Extinction Rebellion, which is very it's disruption. You can put whatever moniker before that you want, and try not to put a value on it, but it's a particular type of disruption, right? And then we had someone on previously from Climate X, where they build solutions for major enterprise companies to really understand their carbon footprint and to build, more sustainable solutions and products and things looking forward, very much an inside solution. So curious to understand like where Force of Nature sits in all of that, how you see yourselves playing, amongst the other actors in the climate change movement.
So we really see ourselves at the entry point of really ongoing action. And what I mean by that is like where we go into companies and have conversations around like mindset. We actually start typically with our research tools, which we developed, which actually just quantitatively and qualitatively give us the data that says this is where a company currently is on their climate journey. And so we really look at like, what are the barriers to action? What are the opportunities in terms of like what's already being explored? Where are people feeling? And so we measure things like how psychologically safe is the workplace? Do people feel they can challenge one another or challenge their superiors to bring like transformational ideas to the table? Do folks feel like there is a focus on sustainability? What's their definition of sustainability, right? Because it's so easy to like use this language in companies that becomes really jargony and then doesn't end up meaning anything, or like we forget the meaning because it's gone through so many iterations. And so we come into the companies with these research tools so we can really understand what's happening. And then we call them workshops, and they are workshops, but they're really like facilitated discussions as well as workshops. So we bring in, information on the kind of data that we've seen, and we talk about and provoke conversation within the workshop space around like what those barriers are, really unpacking them and sort of like challenging some of the barriers that are there as well in terms of seeing like, understanding the business model and what's happening and where people are feeling really like shut down rather than able to take action or push things further. It varies so widely by company what we see, but the reason we call it constructive disruption is that it is disruptive, it is uncomfortable, but equally we don't want people to walk away feeling shut down, which is something that we see often when there is like disruption in a space, right? Folks can easily get very defensive or feel very like attacked. And we focus our work with companies that we believe have the biggest potential to shift or like influence major shifts within industry, within like, for example, we focus on like fast moving consumer goods companies because we know that like materials and consumption are like a huge business, but also like a huge currently burden on the planet in many cases. But there's also so much amazing disruption happening in those spaces. And so pushing like these larger kind of perhaps more established companies who are still doing things the way that used to be good for business, but are not good for people and planet. We go into these spaces and then have these discussions. And there's often already climate activists within the midst, right? There's folks who are climate champions within these companies who are pushing, who feel in many cases like they're coming up against walls again and again, feeling really like exhausted by challenging the structural norms of these companies that have been around for many, many years. And so when we go in, we're often invited by these specific folks. And then we end up working with their teams and then another team and then another team. And because they are these huge companies, we end up working across multiple departments, ultimately seeing the kind of like shift from the thinking of what would work in the current model to what actually is possible. What can we challenge? What can we shift? And so when we talk about constructive disruption, it's because of this. It's that we are going in and disrupting, and equally we're teaching people how to disrupt themselves and disrupt the kind of like status quo of the environment they find themselves in. And equally, we want it to be constructive because we do believe that on a human to human level, there are people within these spaces who are driving the transformational change just as much as we are from the outside on the inside. And it's really important that those people also are supported and that the kind of movement can be built through that. So I think rather than we talk about stepping up rather than shutting down, like that's really important in our kind of theory of change around mindsets and methodology as well. And so that's where the constructive piece comes in.
And I think there were like some seedlings in what you were saying about some success stories that you've seen. So we'd love to hear, like one or two examples of, where you think Force of Nature has been particularly successful in fostering that, constructive disruption.
We've seen a lot of kind of niche success stories from young people sitting on advisory boards for different companies, which I can't go into too much at this point because many of these things are still in the works. But what we have seen is that when young people are in these spaces, mindsets fundamentally do shift. And obviously there's a lot of work that goes into it. Young people don't just like show up, there are these workshops and these processes, like I mentioned, to ensure that mindsets are ripe for disruption just as much as they're being disrupted. But we have seen in many of these cases, like leaders of some of these huge companies fundamentally shifting the way they're talking about the way business runs and also talking about like what the future of the business looks like, challenging, we recently founded a group called The Biome, which for us is a group of like top level business leaders from companies who we've worked with, who are on their own climate action journey, who are like sort of climate catalysts within their organization. So these are folks who are like CSOs or in some cases like heads of innovation, head of HR from different top companies we've worked with. And we brought them together in a collective group because we heard this question coming up often of like, who's doing this in other companies? Because there is this feeling that can come from being an activist or a kind of someone who's pushing for sustainability and climate action within a company, this feeling of being alone and not knowing who's doing it really well. And so we brought this group together so that community could start being built and that, there could be this cross-pollination of ideas and the sort of like challenge that could happen. And we brought our young consultants in. So we trained up a cohort of young consultants at the beginning of the year who we call the Canopy members. And they have now experienced going into many companies on youth advisory boards or leading workshops that we designed or actually running panel interventions within these companies. And so we brought this cohort of people together. And in that room, we had folks sharing their personal emotions around the crisis. We had people sharing what they're really challenged by in their business environments. And we had conversations about anti-capitalism and gender representation within climate action, and conversations about, how consumption models of production and consumption have to change. And these are people who are running some of the top companies in the world that are producing goods, and they're challenging the whole model of what it means to be a business in the world, and how actually business should be a force for good and should be predicated on that. It shouldn't be an afterthought or a nice to have, but actually what does it look like for solutions that are not just developing more products to sell more products, but actually supporting communities through the sort of influence and activation ability that these companies have. And so that, obviously sitting here and saying all that without any names of who these people are or the companies makes it kind of hard or intangible. But for us, we measure on the other side, the real success we've had getting young people into these spaces. And so when we launched our trainings early this year, we initially piloted them with 50 young people going through to actually train up to become public speakers or to be able to consult with businesses. So understanding greenwash, understanding how to pick apart a sustainability strategy, and also how to have conversations in these rooms as well, because there are so many barriers to young people coming into business spaces, right? When you start talking about what a board of trustees is, the kind of jargon and language we use in business, it's not something that is taught to young people typically. And we also, trained up young people to facilitate these eco-anxiety workshops in schools. And since then, we've seen these young people go out into these opportunities. We've linked them up with stages to speak on and businesses to consult in, and schools and communities, in even their own schools and communities they went into and ran workshops. And all of these opportunities have been paid. So this is one of our biggest successes as Force of Nature, and something that we intend to really build on in the next year as well. And beyond that is, yes, we are working with young people and folks in businesses and folks in classrooms across the world to understand their climate emotions. But on the other side, we're actually training young people, once they understand those emotions, how they can go out into their sphere of influence and take actions that are within their skill set that they're excited about taking, and can do all of that with economic stability, to be able to go out and not just know how to take action, but be empowered to take action in a really real way as well. And so we want to keep making those connections and connect young people up with opportunities, and at the same time, learn from and partner with organizations that are also enabling young people to go out and do this work, because we see that kind of inner sustainability as well as outer sustainability as being really important within the whole movement. And it's a place that we're excited to play in.
You landed on a really important point there, because it strikes me that, obviously this whole thing, this massive thing, is going to take lots of really great partnerships. And luckily for us, that's, what you're focused on in Force of Nature. So we'd love to hear, about the partnerships that you're excited about. I know you're probably limited in what you can talk about, but sort of maybe telling our audience about the broad nature of the partnerships and what makes them, you think, particularly effective in the way that you've set them up.
We've been really excited to partner with more and more youth organizations in the space, because we do see this work is needed, and we want to both enable young people who come through our community to go on in their own journey to contribute, but that we also want to enable other groups who work in parallel to us to continue. And so we've quite a few partnerships across youth organizations and even in other environmental organizations, particularly in the UK right now. I would say our focus has really been on the UK and Europe. And now we're building out more kind of specific partnerships in terms of, obviously, I mentioned our training for our youth speakers. We've been partnering with a number of different kind of speaker hubs or stages that exist in the world that are, platforming voices, including young voices now, through the speakers who we've brought up through our training. So folks like Extreme International, who are a big platform who brought a stage to COP26 last year and will be again at COP27 this year, and are going to be doing ongoing events beyond that. We've been kind of looking at, especially on the research side, and also the bringing young people into these spaces who aren't represented in these spaces. There's an amazing research and marketing agency group team. They're doing so much that's incredible, called Word on the Curb, who we're really looking to partner with in the next kind of year to develop some programs and actually ensure that that there are like young people from different backgrounds represented in the work that we do. And then on a wider scale, getting young people these opportunities is one side of the partnership, but the other side of the partnership is also like, how do we ensure that the industries and the groups that need most to be disrupted are being disrupted? And so we have quite a few partnerships that are kind of like underway with, different consultancy groups or folks who are doing amazing work around really digging into sustainability and measures around things like emissions or like product life cycle or materials impact and things like that, where they're already working on the sustainability consulting side, but are also coming up against challenges around like companies who potentially are having trouble even like shifting their mindset towards wanting to do business differently. And they're starting to like bring us into those clients as well. So there's sort of like a whole world of partnerships. And we really see ourselves as like part of this much larger ecosystem where, we bring in the kind of theory of change around mindset and bring young people into these spaces and equally exist as like part of a much, much bigger whole that's really needed to ensure that there is transformational action happening at a rapid pace.
Sounds amazing. I'm curious, like what particular skills and experiences, as you mentioned, young people are bringing to the movement that you're bringing to Force of Nature in your role of director of partnerships and programming. Like, what has your journey been like? I gather you've worked in a couple of different roles before this current role. So, like, what do you think is the secret sauce that you're bringing to Force of Nature?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Just like let me bring out the self-reflection for a minute. So as I mentioned, I grew up going to the Green School, which is in Bali, Indonesia, and actually happens to be also where the founder of Force of Nature, Clover Hogan, went for a couple of years, and that was part of her climate action journey. But when I left the Green School, the narrative that I had really been fed in school was your generation is going to save the world. And this was terrifying, right? Like I graduated from high school and I was like, oh my gosh, how am I going to save the world? Like
no pressure. Just good luck.
No pressure, no big deal. Just go out and like do your thing. I'm like, okay, that's very nerve-wracking. And I went out and ended up going to university, had the privilege of going to university and just felt like nothing I was doing could possibly do enough. This was the kind of feeling for me. And this is the beginnings of eco-anxiety for me. And it's interesting because I didn't feel it in high school because I was in an environment where, yes, we were told we were supposed to change the world, but also like our classes and our community was geared towards taking action in our local community. And that's like something that I lost when I left Indonesia to go to university in the US, uprooted myself completely, had no connections out there and had to like build from scratch again and felt disconnected from place and sort of all of these other things that as a migrant, I was a voluntary migrant, but it's something that I didn't realize impacted me so deeply. I ended up after university getting into tech and I was living in the US, I was living in San Francisco. So it's very much like the natural thing to get into when you're out there, but it was totally accidental. It was via copywriting and essentially just continually seeing challenges in the ways that people had needs that weren't being met. So, within the organization, I was a copywriter who was interviewing community members about their experience and writing blogs about them. And then the community members were telling me that actually there were all of these challenges with the tech platform that made it unusable for them. And so I started speaking to the software developers and they were saying, well, actually, like we don't have management that allows us to solve those problems because we don't have a clear roadmap. And so then I spoke to management and they said, well, actually, we need someone to manage the software developers. So could you do that? So I went from being like a blog writer to a community manager to a product owner within the span of like 4 years and zero experience in tech. And it just came from this like really deep care for the people who I was interacting with and this really like deep desire to problem solve because I believe that there are always ways that we can do things better. And I think this care for community and building out a community and ensuring that there are like systems to meet people's needs is something that really is like a deep yearning within my soul. And so when I think about like the secret sauce I bring to Force of Nature, as you put it, I think there is definitely like my kind of harder skills in like community and like product management and development from tech has really played a huge role in my role at Force of Nature. Because now as director of partnerships, like we're a team of 13, which is not very big. It's very like startup style, fast moving. Like we have sort of like sprints we run on. We have quarterly plans. Like we have to create a structure that allows us to work entirely remotely and very fast to meet a challenge which we see as urgent. And at the same time, like when I joined, there were 4 of us. And so as one of the 3 directors, I was responsible for setting up what our product plan was and our product map and ensuring that we did have connections to the right people to build the partnerships that we needed in order to grow, in order to eventually hire more people. And at the same time, like that deep care for community just continues to be a central part of my role, whether it's internally for the team or externally for the over 500 young people now who are within our online community. And so I think there's like this kind of mix of like hard skills and then just like really deep desire to do right by people that continues to be really central to my role. Yeah, definitely working in tech, I think, taught me a lot about planning and management of a plan and executing a plan and all the stages. Like, I feel like so much of the product process within tech is really akin to like the scientific process, right? Which includes like research and measurement and iterating and knowing that actually sometimes done is better than good. And that's been really important as like a very small youth startup as well in our journey at Force of Nature.
Yeah, I'm sure it's helped you kind of move faster and smarter and sort of see around corners in ways that maybe, like your typical, activist or, nonprofit person might not, because they haven't been trained in some of those hard skills and things like that. And that's no shade whatsoever. I love people who are career changers. I used to be an educator and work in nonprofits and stuff like that. And I feel like there's loads that I've been able to apply from that, as an agency owner and in different roles. So kudos to you for that.
Thanks.
Push us into our lightning round here. And this is where we kind of ask you like slightly more cheeky, interesting questions that focus on you and kind of give our listeners a bit more of a, insight on who you are as an individual. So we ask this to all of our guests. So no pressure. There's no right answers except for one of the questions. So first things first, we are a tech podcast. So what's been a game-changing piece of tech in your life and why?
Oh my goodness, Notion. 100% hands down. I will be a Notion evangelist until the day that I die.
Notion stands. Yes.
Notion forever is, yeah. I like recently visited London for the first time in a long time and like saw all these like billboards in the tube that were like Notion ads. And I was like, wow, everyone knows now. It's great. It's, a tool that I use in my personal life and at Force of Nature has like fully allowed us to work remotely in a way that we didn't even know was possible. So love Notion. Big fan.
Yeah, I feel like such a corporate stooge sometimes when I like use a product a lot and then I see the billboard and I'm very excited about it. I'm like, oh gosh, like what's wrong with me? I've been bought and sold.
Yeah. Notion used to be indie.
Yeah, not anymore.
Not anymore. Very mainstream. Good for them though. That like we get like better revisions on it and things like that. All sorts of bug fixes we wouldn't get otherwise. So I'm very happy it's as mainstream as it is now.
It's true. Leaning into the name of the podcast, what is one problem that tech can't solve for us and why?
I think that tech can be applied to solve problems only within the limitations of our own imaginations. And so, like, when I think about what problem tech can't solve, it is the problem of mindset or imagination or our thinking. Like, we can't build a more equitable, just, and fair world if we can't imagine what it is. And getting ourselves out of the echo chamber of the norms of society can be really difficult. So, yeah, I think the one problem tech can't solve is the problem of imagination.
You're seeing that in like, developments of AI having bias and things like that. And it sort of harkens back to like, I think one of Arthur C. Clarke's like rules about sort of like technology, that it's like akin to magic, but like that magic has to start in someone's brain to some extent because we're programming and building the thing. So yeah, really, really well said there. To that point, talked a little bit about evil AI. What is the tech for bad, evilist application of tech that you've seen out there?
Oh my goodness. Maybe this is evasive to the question, but like when I think about bad tech, I really think of it as just like a symptom of broken systems, right? Or maybe systems that actually were designed for the purpose they're delivering now, and that purpose is not for the best of humanity, right? Where the system is designed for profit and growth above all. So like I think about all of the things that are huge red flags to me that make my heart break a bit for tech, right? Is like selling people's data, spreading misinformation, exploiting people's attention, or like exploiting people in general, extractivism. It's all done for profit and gain. And, it is within the flaws of humanity for us to like, we are the best and the worst of the systems we've designed. And so I think like all of the tech that for me screams bad is stuff that's not human centered. And they just continue to like disconnect us and they feel really like heartless and compassionless. And you're like, how could we do this to one another? Right. But when it's like, oh, well, tech is doing it. But it's like, okay, but that tech was designed by a person. And so I think it's just, tech is just a manifestation of like our culture and social factors and systems and like flawed human beings. And so I can't pinpoint one evil application because, oh my gosh, there are so many. Yeah, at the moment, it feels like overwhelming. And at the same time, it's like there is another world that's possible.
We'll take it. The correct answer is Facebook, but we're happy to take your answer. We'll just keep it moving.
Facebook is horrendous. There's actually an article that's like the 20 worst tech products in the world. And I'm like reading about it and, it had things like, Starlink for sure. Like, now like astronomers can't see space because like the satellites. And then, you're reading about Facebook and like misinformation or even, like I think about Amazon and like the total monopoly of life as a human being. And I think it's a lot worse in certain countries. But, like the fact that they bought like the Roomba company or whatever, and now suddenly they like see maps in people's homes and can like the amount of data that these companies have in order to sell more stuff or exploit people or put people in jail for their beliefs or, and I just think that like it all is part of such a larger system, and it's incredibly disappointing and heartbreaking that these companies do what they do. And at the same time, I'm like, they're doing it in the name of profit, right? And greed. And that's maybe the most tragic thing of all, is it comes back to these like really human tendencies, which I believe we can do better.
I guess the flip side of that question, if you could design a new tech product, what problem would it solve and for whom?
Oh, okay. I don't by any means claim to be like a really like I'm partnerships and programs director, right? That's not visionary, it's a how person. But yeah, I came up with some kind of like idealistic ideas, but then when I actually sat with it for a while, like I think we already have a lot of the technology and thinking we need to create like this better world I keep alluding to. And obviously better world for me is subjective. My better world might look different than your better world, but when I refer to better world, what I'm hoping for is like a more equitable and just and fair future for everyone. And I think like one thing that I've seen starting to happen more now, but like if I could dream up a new tech product or like an advancement of these tech products, it would be on and around like total transparency and accountability. Like, I think about things like the blockchain and the potential that had for total transparency and accountability. And instead, like what it's largely morphed into is another vehicle for profit making. But like if we could really see and hold to account and all committed to this kind of like transparency around like our impact in the world, on like social impact on people, like the environmental impact, total transparency in a way that allows us to like measure and really like hold to account companies and organizations and governments. I think that would be super powerful. And there's a lot of these things that kind of already exist in different forms, but aren't all communicating with each other at this very point in time or things like that. So I think that would be a really major one. Or like some kind of tech to totally redistribute finance to countries and communities that need it the most for like loss and damage. I think that would be the other one. But I don't know if that's a tech product so much as like a drive to action, which maybe could be advanced by some sort of tech product that included all the transparency needed to like see where all those funds were going to in a really meaningful way.
Strikes me that like a lot of the reason we have some of the problems we do is because people can get away with it, and there isn't sunlight, in a lot of these areas about like the flights you're taking and how you're voting and how your company is, investing in X, Y, and Z. And I think if that was a little bit more transparent, we'd probably see some behavioral changes. So that's it. That's a great answer. We'll round us out with this final question. We like to ask everyone as a Tech for Good podcast, how do you balance, profit and purpose in your life? And then what sort of advice would you have to the audience?
Well, as a person who works for a nonprofit organization, I think we can imagine that obviously my drive towards profit is fairly low. At the same time, like I think there's an important balance between like recognizing the flaws of the system we exist within and still living within that system with enough like compassion and forgiveness for yourself and others within that system to be able to like seek the humanity in one another and still move things forward to transformational change. So that was like a very like wordy way to say I have definitely at this point in my life prioritized purpose and impact because I see the work that I'm doing as a vehicle towards the future that I want to build. And at the same time, like anyone else, I seek to make enough money to like live a life that allows myself and my family like safety and comfort and security. I think my philosophy above all else is to tread lightly with as much compassion as possible and live in a way that makes the world and the people I come in contact with better in some way for themselves, like not based on my judgment, but that I can hopefully like improve and add to the lives of all those who I interact with. And I think the same applies to my philosophy around like work and finance. Is if I'm looking at what I'm doing and if any part of me has sort of a moral question or feels that I may be exploiting someone, that's an immediate red flag of like, okay, I need to change the way that I'm approaching this thing or doing this thing. And I think that as much as possible, if we can think from this perspective of like regeneration, like what are we doing to contribute to the communities we exist within? I recently joined a community cooperative. Their whole philosophy is like, if you are taking from a system, you should also be contributing to it. And so I'm really thinking in this way of this sort of circular, like what am I inputting and what am I gaining? And how do I ensure that that balance is never out of balance, but rather is always able to continue flowing in the same way as like the symbiosis within an ecosystem would? Because we are ultimately part of nature, not separate from it. And I think that's really important for us as human beings to understand, so we remain connected.
Those two pieces you mentioned, the regenerative, sort of principles and our connection to, as part of nature, I think are just like such valuable principles that I think I can see the climate change movement latching onto more and more because they just seem so accessible and so commonsensical, for people. So I think that's really important that you flag that and something, we hope a lot of our viewers latch onto. Really appreciated this conversation. Kat Hamilton, Director of Partnerships and Programs at Force of Nature. It's been awesome to talk to you and hear about all the great things you're doing to push the movement forward. So really thank you for your time.
Thank you, Paul.
And real quick, where can folks find more about you and Force of Nature on the interwebs?
Find us on our website, which is www.forceofnature.xyz, or Z if you're from the UK. And our social media handle also is forceofnature.xyz. And it's Kat Hamilton. You can find me on all social media platforms. Do connect. I'm always up for having more conversations like these.
Amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time today, Kat. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Paul. Much appreciated.